Mr. Scott, seconded by Ms. Latendresse, moves that, in the opinion of the House, the Government of Canada, in consultation with the provinces and territories, should take immediate steps toward abolishing the unelected and unaccountable Senate of Canada. Debate. The honourable member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's time to roll up the red carpet. It's my honour to rise today on behalf of my constituents of Toronto-Danforth to speak on this motion, which I will restate, that in the opinion of the House, the Government of Canada, in consultation with the provinces and territories, should take immediate steps towards abolishing the unelected and unaccountable Senate of Canada. To that motion, I would like to add, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition, the official opposition, is fully prepared and ready to cooperate with the government in this task of consulting with the provinces and the territories. We have enough experience with cooperation. Our leader, the member for Outremont, has led the way in starting to talk to the provinces as a mode of cooperative federalism, and the means by which the Senate will be abolished can only proceed through that avenue. Now, the NDP has, since its very inception, been firmly in support of Senate abolition, and indeed calls for abolition also came from our predecessor, the CCF. Now, the NDP has also long believed that the people of Canada should be consulted as part of the abolition process, and this remains important. But we need to start here, in the House of Commons. We need to send an extremely strong signal that the time has come. We're at a historic moment. People have come to realize that the Senate is an archaic, otiose institution. But we have to start here, in the House of Commons, send the signal, begin to work with the provinces and the territories, something it does seem that our Prime Minister seems allergic to. And before I continue, Mr. Speaker, I should say that I'm going to be splitting my time with the honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. It's important to note that the government has put a reference to the Supreme Court of Canada, where the question of abolition is one of the questions. Now, it's also important to clear up confusion. The Supreme Court will not be deciding one way or the other whether the Senate should be abolished. That's a political decision that we are starting to initiate here. But it will tell us what the correct amending formula under the Constitution is. There's debate on that. It's almost certain that it's not less than 750. That is 7 provinces with 50% of the population. The Constitutional Amendment Act will also come into play, where certain provinces, including Ontario and Quebec, have to be involved in the amendment. But it could also be unanimous consent of the provinces along with the federal Parliament, Mr. Speaker. We'll wait to see what the Supreme Court says. We'll be very interested to see what the Supreme Court says. But the key is to note that on either of those formulas, unanimous consent or 750, ultimately the Senate does not have to consent to its own abolition. On either of those formulas, the Senate can resist, according to the 1982 Constitution Act, but it cannot ultimately block its own abolition. Unlike the method that the Prime Minister is using with his Bill C7, where he's purporting to amend the Constitution by only going through the Parliament with an ill-conceived scheme, where he knows that the Senate's consent is necessary, because under that form of amendment by the Parliament of Canada alone, which again is not applicable here, and the Prime Minister knows it, that's why he's finally gone to the Supreme Court to get clarity, by amendment by Parliament alone, you need Senate's consent. So it's a nice turn that the Supreme Court will tell us which amending formula applies, and that when we eventually work with the provinces to get the necessary number of provinces and legislatures on board, we won't ultimately be blocked by our friends in the Senate. Now, Mr. Speaker, like an Edsel, the Senate was obsolete almost from the moment it was built. Somehow, however, this one is still on the road. But, Mr. Speaker, its lights are broken, the body is totally corroded, the wheels are wobbly, and the engine has all been seized up by dirty oil. And now it may still have a very, very plush interior. But, Mr. Speaker, it's time to send it to the scrapyard. The Senate has long ceased to have any meaningful connection to the supposed original reasons for its existence. One of those reasons is the principle of representing the regions, 4 different regions, and provinces within the regions. From as early as the 1930s, reaffirmed in the 50s and the 60s, commentators noted that this never was a function that was seriously carried out by the Senate. It was not built for that. It did not operate in that way. And indeed, over time, in fact, very early on, it's the Supreme Court, the Privy Council, and then taken over by the Supreme Court of Canada, that has served as the institution that protects federalism within our constitutional structure. We don't need the Senate for that purpose. And there's only a handful of senators, 12, 15, perhaps it's 20, who make a serious contribution to sober second thought, which is the other major function. They do good work, they're assisted by good staff, they're conscientious, and I can bet, Mr. Speaker, that they resent the presence of many of their colleagues in the Senate who have brought this institution down around their own ears. There are good senators. We do hope to work with those senators if abolition does not occur before this party forms government in 2015. There are good senators who we hope to work with, and I believe will work with, who generally act in a thoughtful, nonpartisan fashion, but most importantly, Mr. Speaker, realize whatever their political stripe, very strongly conservative, very strongly liberal, independent, they realize that the Senate is an illegitimate body when it comes to blocking bills coming from the House of Commons. And it's with those senators that we will work on the road to abolition and in any period in which we have to govern with the Senate still in place. Meanwhile, last year, whatever number of senators with a few vacancies are still there, 100 or so, while they bask in the comfort of, frankly, a sinecure appearing on average 56 days a year in the Senate, we in the House of Commons are doing the work of the people of Canada. It's important to note all of the controversy over residence and everything else, which my colleagues will speak to in more detail. The senators have no constituency responsibilities, yet they have budgets and they spend much more than we do, frankly, when you add up all their travel. They have no constituency responsibilities. Nobody expects them to engage in that, and they don't do it. Yet many of them roam around the country. They rack up the miles, Mr. Speaker, with no role on the ground that has any legitimacy, and I won't say accept, but what they do, they're great fundraisers, Mr. Speaker. Many of these senators we know come from fundraising background, they come from a party background, they're there only as a favor to what they did for their party in the past, and they continue in that role. One of the most significant features of what I would call the structural corruption of the Senate, I'm not going to the ethics of individual senators, I'm talking about the structural corruption of the body, is how it has served and continues to serve as the means by which 2 parties in particular send out a phalanx, a virtually phalanx of publicly paid individuals to raise money for their parties. One party's doing that a lot better than the other these days. I acknowledge that. The party in power uses its senators extremely deftly. And I'd be extremely interested, Mr. Speaker, to know what, for example, an Auditor General audit of the Senate would reveal about the use of parliamentary travel funds for fundraising purposes. But let's just say the Senate is very good at hiding the reasons for travel, and at the moment we don't know the exact reasons for which some senators have racked up amazing travel budgets. Now, I indicated at the beginning that the Senate, Mr. Speaker, is frankly an Edsel. And it's an Edsel in a couple of respects. From the beginning, thoughtful commentators knew that it would be a hyper-partisan body, not fulfilling the functions originally envisaged. I'd like to read from a wonderfully named book, The Unreformed Senate of Canada, page 45, an objection from the opposition at the time, 1867, David Reeser, when he says, "We know what the tendency is in England and what it was in the country when the government had the appointment of the Legislative Council. The effect will be to find a place in this House for men distinguished for the aid they have given at elections to certain men or parties and not as a reward of true merit or legislative ability." Nothing has changed, Mr. Speaker, nor have the words of Sir John A. Macdonald, and I will end here. He said, quote, "There should be a large property qualification in the upper house, which is then the representative of property," unquote. The Senate, having voted down the former leader's Climate Change Accountability Act, they have shown that they are the continuation of the defense of property that Sir John A. Macdonald wanted the institution to be so many years ago. It's time for that to end, Mr. Speaker.
Here.